time to go over some baking techniques. One of the hardest lessons for me to learn about baking in the backcountry is that it doesn't have to be an exact science. There's a lot of room for creativity and experimentation with these techniques. The first choice you have to make is how are you going to leaven your baked good? In this case, we'll be making bread. I've got two choices. I can use a ratio of 1:1 baking powder, baking soda, and I've got mine pre-mixed already. Or I can use a little bit of yeast. Baking powder and baking soda is going to be really fast. I don't really need to give my bread a whole lot of time to rise on its own before I start cooking it. Now the yeast is going to give me a little bit higher of a rise. It'll also change the texture and make it a little bit lighter, whereas the baking powder and baking soda is going to be a little bit flatter and maybe a little bit more chewy. So again, that's something you can experiment with. Some products work better with baking powder, baking soda, some work better with yeast. To get my yeast activated, I've got some water on to boil. I'm boiling the water to treat it and to sanitize it. It's really important that when you make your dough, you're using treated water. Doesn't necessarily have to have been boiled, but it's also important to get the water you're using for your yeast up to a particular temperature, which is technically 110 degrees. So once I have it boiled, I'm going to turn off my stove and let that water cool down. Now I'll know it's the right temperature when I can stick my finger in the water and my finger doesn't get burned or feel cold. A strategy that I use to kind of speed up this waiting for the water to be at the right temperature process is to pour a little bit of the water out and then add in a little treated cold water. And anytime you pour out treated water, you should probably save it just in case somebody wants a drink. And I've got about a cup of water here is what I'm going for. That still needs a second. Right. And that's perfect. My pinky doesn't feel hot and it doesn't feel cold. It's really good bath water temperature right now. So I'm going to add a little bit of sugar. This is for the yeast organisms to feed on. It's going to help them replicate, which is where I get my rise from. And in my cup of water, I might do a tablespoon or two of sugar in here. And then I get these yeast packets and they're little individual ones. Makes measuring really easy. And just pour them right on in there. And you can always give it a little stir, doesn't have to happen. And you'll start to see my yeast organisms coming together and then bubbling right back up to the top. And this process could take about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the ambient temperature of the air and the temperature of your water and how much sugar you put in. Just a note, if you use brown sugar, you're going to want to use an awful lot more sugar. I would probably double the amount of sugar in here if I was using brown as opposed to white. And you don't necessarily need to watch your yeast activate. I kind of like to just till I get a feel for whether or not I've put enough sugar in there. If you don't notice a lot of movement in your little yeast clumps, then you might want to add a little bit more. And what I'm noticing now is that my yeast bubbles are kind of rising to the surface. They're moving kind of slow, so I do think I'm going to add in a little bit more sugar here. I don't need to sit here for the 5 to 10 minutes that it's going to take for my yeast to fully activate. So I'm going to take my cup of hot water and go have some tea. Oh wow, that yeast got really active really fast. And don't worry, if you got distracted and you walked away for a little bit more than 5 to 10 minutes, it's gonna be totally fine. You can't let this rise too long. You could let the water get too cold and that would kill the yeast, but that'll take longer than about 15 minutes. So the things in this yeast pot that I'm really excited about are those mounds, the kind of pillowy looking things. That means that my yeast is replicating and building upon itself, which is going to create those nice fluffy air holes in my bread. If your yeast wasn't quite as active as mine, you might just get kind of a thin film of foam, maybe looks like spoiled beer, and that's okay too. What you want is all the yeast conglomerating into one area and then those kind of air bubbles coming up. The next step is to mix my yeast water in with my flour. I have a really big bag of flour here. Typically, if I go out for a long time or with a lot of people, I'll just carry a big old bag and then portion it out per meal. I make a lot of different recipes with flour, so it makes sense to just have the giant bag. To mix just one serving of bread, I'm going to take another bag and then just pour a little bit of this flour in there. And usually a pound of flour is gonna make a big enough bread for about 5 to 6 people. So I'm gonna do about 1/2 to 3/4 of a pound of flour right now. And I am gonna do that just by guesstimation. And I do this a lot, so I'm pretty comfortable just pouring and guessing the weight. If you have a camp cup, that can be a really useful way to measure the amount of flour that you're putting into this bag. All right, that's good. Okay. My next step is to mix my yeast water and my flour together. Now, I might not use all of this water that I've got ready in my bag of flour, so it's important that I pour just a little bit of water at a time into my bag. If I start pouring all of this flour into this pot, then what might happen is that I don't have enough flour to soak up all the water, meaning that I have this soupy, weird, doughy mixture that I can't use for anything and that I then have to carry around with me for the rest of my trip. So slow and steady, nice and carefully, adding a little bit of the yeast water into your flour. And another thing, if you don't have extra clean bags lying around camp, you can definitely mix this dough in a pot. It'll just be the same thing. You fill the pot with a little bit of flour and then slowly add water to that flour. So here I go, pouring just a little bit at a time. This is another great opportunity for a small cup if you have one. Then I'm carefully gonna work the flour and the water together. So sometimes you might get a hunk of dry flour stuck in your corner of your bag. So it's a good idea to focus on turning your corners inside out every once in a while just to clean them out. And then I'll use my knee or my legs a lot while I knead so that I can really move this dough around in there and make sure I don't have dry pockets of flour in the middle of my dough either. All right, time for a little bit more water. The goal here is to make the dough sticky enough that it sticks to itself, but not so sticky that it sticks to the bag. So I'm constantly just kind of turning my bag over and around in a circle. And right here I'm starting to get little flaky bits. Looks almost like a pie crust at this point, and that's a good sign. That means I'm doing a good job of evenly mixing the small amount of water that I do have in this bag. Kneading your dough is probably the most time-consuming process of baking, but it's not the step to rush. Having a nice, thorough, and even mixture is really gonna increase the quality of your bread. And if you mess up here, then you might have to carry out a big wad of garbage with you. You can see that my dough is starting to clump together a lot more now. Looking through this transparent bag, I can definitely still see some dry pockets of flour. So now my kneading is just getting a little bit more local. If I see a dry pocket, I'm gonna focus on that exact spot. So you can see here that if I pick up just the bag, it comes away fairly cleanly from the dough itself. So this is a really good sign. This is where things get tricky because I'm so close to having the perfect consistency here. I want to make sure I'm really controlled with the amount of water I add in. Today I'm making a plain dough, but you might get fancy and decide you want to add some cinnamon in here or maybe some garlic and flavor your dough before you bake it. For my final step in the kneading process, I'm going to try and get my dough into a little ball. It's just going to be easier to get out of the bag at that point. And again, you can see that it's really easy to peel the bag away from this ball of dough. So you can see little air pockets in my ball of dough right now. That's the yeast still working to leaven my bread. I'm gonna give it one last chance to get that nice bready texture that I'm looking for, and I'm gonna set this out to rise for, again, about 10 or 15 minutes. I've got a pretty warm day right now, so I can just find a sunny spot to lay my dough down. And I don't have the top of my bag sealed, it's open. I'm not gonna widely open it, but I do want a little bit of airflow in there. If you're camping in the cold and you want to let your dough rise, a trick that I do is to zip it up inside a jacket close to my skin, and then my body heat is going to help the yeast to rise.